While I'm pulling this up, I'm with an architecture and engineering firm. I'm the director of engineering with that firm, Huckabee. And so I'm going to start off talking about something that's architectural, even though I am not an architect, and that is the approaches to historic masonry projects. This ties into the U.S. Department of Interior guidelines. And some of you may be familiar with those. Some of the students we have here today, I would imagine, are not. And it's important to understand when we say historic masonry, what we're talking about today. Before I go much further, let me just give you a general layout of the day. We're going to have a break for about 15 minutes mid-morning. We're going to have a 1-hour lunch, and we're going to have another break about mid-afternoon for about 15 minutes, and we should wrap up around 4:30. The beginning sessions are going to be more fundamentals, and then covering the basic topics that more of an introduction to some of these areas. But in the afternoon is going to be where you have more of the case histories of specific projects where we have cases where we have identified a problem and where we have tried a restoration technique. And so that's the general layout of the day. When we talk about historic masonry, I'm sure that if we asked everybody in this room, everybody would have a different definition of historic masonry. In general, we're referring to unreinforced masonry structures. And that's one commonality that I think if we were to ask everybody in their mind, they would be thinking about an unreinforced building. It's most likely brick masonry. It might be concrete masonry if you look at certain instances, but majority of it would be brick masonry and stone masonry. Stone and brick are both very common historical elements. And the character of a building, its place in history, can also make it historical. And this today is not about so much that as it is about the technical aspect of historical masonry restoration. The Secretary of the Interior's standards for historic preservation projects defines really 4 different approaches: preservation, rehabilitation, restoration, and reconstruction. And you may have heard these terms before. Some people misuse them. It's easy to do because they all have similarities in how they sound. And sometimes you'll have a project where the overall approach is one way, but you'll find that there's a small element that's being treated a different way. It's important with any particular project to get everybody on the same game plan, because you'll find that, for example, structural engineers like me, often what we want to do is the first instinct when we see a real problem is let's tear it down and rebuild it. Reconstruction, make it look the same, right? Whereas you might find some people that want to take a much more different approach, and the costs, the time it takes to do those are very, very different with those different approaches. Factors in selecting that approach, you look at the relative importance in history of the structure. You look at its physical condition. Is it deteriorated? And the proposed use. Is it simply a museum for yourself? You're the only one who cares about it. Or is it a museum for the public? Or is it a facility that has got a commercial use? We also need to look at mandated code requirements. And we'll talk a little bit more in detail about where that comes in with structural issues and other MEP issues. I'd like to point out that even though the department has done a really good job of identifying 4 distinct approaches, really within each of these approaches you'll find in reality there are purists and there are pragmatists. And an example of that's most common with these projects is some people are purists in that they want to preserve the actual material, whereas some people are more what I'd call pragmatists, whereas they are trying to preserve the appearance. And really, for example, the Texas Historical Commission really is more of the latter, although they want to obviously try to preserve the actual materials if possible. A good example of this is you look at some of the temples in Japan that have been around for generations and generations, centuries. They look identical to how they were when they were originally constructed, and that's because when a beam is rotten, they replace the beam with a new beam. They've done that ever since they moved in. And so, the actual pieces of the puzzle don't have to be the same pieces of the puzzle, right? It's the use of the facility, it's the appearance of the facility, it's the material and what it stands for. Preservation It's got a long definition in this document I'm referring to, which is available online. I've highlighted some of the key aspects. It's to sustain existing materials. You're going to want to stabilize elements. It's basically a maintenance and a repair project. In the bottom, I've italicized something that's also common in all four approaches, which is the U.S. Department of Interior understands at some level this is going to be for people. And desires and standards for comfort have changed over the years, so limited and sensitive upgrading of mechanical, electrical, plumbing systems and other code-required work is understandable. We live in a real world. This is an example. The two pictures look identical other than the quality of the photograph. One was taken when it was originally built, and the other was after it was restored. Rehabilitation is when you're taking a structure that you want to modify it for a compatible use, perhaps, but you want to preserve portions or features which are historically significant. An example of that here is on the left is before a rehabilitation project, what was on the corner of a square, where you can see a more modern awning, the blue awning. The brickwork had been painted over the years, many different layers of paint. And on the right, you can see how they've chemically treated the brick and they've removed the paint. That's a very difficult process, but there are companies that can work with you, and sometimes you can do that more successfully than other times. And they removed the awning. In this case, they actually added windows, which changed the features of the building, but they did it in a historically sensitive way. It matches the character, the craftsmanship of that era, and it matches the windows that you see on the left-hand picture that are in white on the left. So that's a rehabilitation. Restoration is where you're really trying to roll back the clock to make it back to look the same as it did originally, or at least at a specific period in time. This may involve removal of things that were not contemporary to that period, or this may involve reconstructing things that were there but have disappeared. A good example is this brownstone in New York. On the left, that's the original picture of when it was recently built. And then in the middle is how deteriorated it had become over the decades and decades. On the right, you can see the restoration after its completion. And you'll notice, for example, the balcony. Let me use my laser pointer here. All right. The original balcony was a functioning balcony, and it fell off with deterioration over time. And in the restoration, it was no longer able to be used as a balcony that functions, but they did a nod to it architecturally by putting that piece back. Another example is how the plywood windows were put in with new windows that matched the appearance of the original windows. This is restoration. And the old Astoria Hotel was not placed there because it's no longer a hotel. So it's not an exact restoration. And I think that's a classic example of that. And of course, this is a great way to preserve our history and the significance of those architectural elements. Reconstruction is the fourth, and really that's the least desirable, but sometimes it's your only choice. It's when you have essentially nothing to work with, but you want to try to show what the historical structure was and recreate it. So it's basically new construction, but you're trying to recreate it as best you can to its appearance for a specific time. This was done in 1930. It's the Governor's Palace in Virginia, and it was done of a reconstruction of a facility that was originally built in the 1800s. And it had essentially been rubble on the ground, but they used the same foundation as the layout, and then the illustrations of the time, and then they reconstructed it. And then the last slide on this segment here on architectural approaches to historical masonry, I'd like to talk about some of the important things to remember with your design and construction agreements. One of the things that I find a lot of times on historical projects is the owners, the people who are motivated truly to make the project happen, have a very short timeline in their mind on how they want this to occur. And the shorter the timeline on a historical project, the budget's going to increase significantly because people have to go in there and they have to make a lot of assumptions, and they have to go in blind and then deal with it once they get into the building. A much more appropriate approach is to have a longer period of time that you can accept if you can accept it. Risk versus reward is a standard terminology in any agreement, right? If I'm going to take the risk in an agreement, the liability, then I'm going to be the one that's going to get a big fee. If you're going to be the one who takes the risk, then accordingly, the fee should be structured differently. So, for example, if you have a contractor who you want him to take care of everything, and you don't want to think about the details, well, then you're brushing with a really broad brushstroke. And so a contractor has to have a lot of money in that agreement to take care of all the things that might come up that you might want as an owner. So being more specific will bring that cost down. To be more specific, you have to have more information, and that takes time. Phasing the investigation and the design and the construction as 3 separate phases is highly recommended whenever possible for that reason. And there are different types of agreements. These are not the only 2, but these are some of the most common. Competitive proposals, where you look at people's qualifications, their schedule that they propose, looking at their cost that they propose. Also looking at cost-plus contracts. That's where essentially whatever the cost is to that contractor, you're going to pay directly, and then you're going to have some markup, either a fixed fee or percentage markup of that cost. And that's better when you have no idea what you're going to get into, but you can pay for it. And with that, I will have Andreas come up, Dr. Stavridis.